Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. It's Sunday and it's a great day to harp on the young generation, the millennial generation, and of course the up and coming Generation Z. Now, when I criticize the millennials and the Generation Z, it should be known that I'm really criticizing the parents because they are to blame for all of this. And this goes back many generations. Every generation since the 1900s has arguably become more and more dependent on technology in order to survive. Therefore, every generation complains about the generation before them, and for good reason. The generation that came before me was well within their rights to criticize my generation because we didn't have it as hard as they did. And the things that we found challenging, they probably thought it was a walk in the park. Now, just to give you a bit of context, I am 36 years old, so technically I fall within the millennial generation, which was the generation, I should add, that came after the Generation X generation. Now, the Generation X were the children of the baby boomers. So you had baby boomers, which were the hippies. You had the children of the hippies, which were the Generation X. Then you had the millennials, which were the children of the Generation X. And now you have the Generation Z, which are essentially the children of the millennial generation. Now, as you probably can imagine, I'm going to be critical of the millennial and Generation Z's capability of weathering a post-collapse environment. I'm going to give you a variety of different premises that I believe substantiate the conclusion that millennials are going to have a very miserable existence in a post-collapse environment. Now, this list is by no means exhaustive. I'm sure that there's going to be 101 more contributions in the comments section with regards to this, but I need to reiterate that this is not an attack on the young generation. In fact, half of my demographic that watches my videos are actually people who are younger than me. So one half of my viewership is over 36 and the other half is under 36. This is not to attack you and your generation. As a person who favors the social constructivist view, that is one that dictates that we learn based on modeling of the predecessor generation. I believe that the ineptitude of millennials and Generation Z is totally the fault of the parents and the parents of those parents going all the way back, perhaps who knows how long it's been happening. But we can assume that it's been happening a long time. Now, in spite of everything I say in this video, one of the saving graces for the young generations, those people on this side of my age, is something called neuroplasticity. And now I'm not sure if the conventions have changed, but when I was in university and I took neuroscience, one of the understandings was that when you were young or when you were an infant, you actually have the most brain cells you're ever going to have. The problem is that you don't have many pathways between those brain cells. And as we age, many brain cells die off. We lose a lot of brain cells. Now they're saying that brain cells have the ability to regrow. That's more recent knowledge, which is post my stint in academia. But the idea is the younger you are, the more adaptable and the more flexible you are to learning. So if there was some major disaster calamity which turned the world upside down, a younger person, even though they're going to lack in the characteristics that I'm going to talk about today, and that they've been conditioned to be in many cases weaker and more ill-prepared than previous generations, they have the advantage of neuroplasticity and the ability to be more flexible in their adaptation. They can learn. That old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And for the most part, that's true because your brain gets so hardwired and there's so few neurons left and so few pathways yet to create between those brain cells, it becomes very complicated, especially when you've lived your entire life in a certain routine. The expectation that you're going to change all of a sudden and adapt to these changing circumstances is not realistic. So for instance, the only way that a person who, say, doesn't know how to grow food is going to learn how to grow food is if somebody teaches them. There has to be a mentorship there by somebody. So the millennial and Generation Z generations, if there was some large-scale disaster, they would need somebody to teach them. And in that respect, they would be more adaptable and flexible, and they would be sponges for that sort of thing. However, there's many complications with that. A lot of the passive forms of parenting you see displayed nowadays can almost be construed to be a form of child abuse because they don't prepare the child for what the world actually is. But in some cases, as we'll talk about, this is part of the program, because a lot of the task of disciplining children and providing them structure, where that used to be the task of the family unit, has now been offloaded onto the grid, onto institutions like psychiatry, social work, the education system, the police, the medical system. You have all these authorities enforcing these various bylaws that dictate the lives of your children. Consider the irony in the fact that in Canada and many parts of the United States, you are not allowed to use corporal punishment on your children. It's seen as child abuse, even if it's just a rap on the bum because your kid runs out to the street and almost gets clipped by traffic, and you try to teach them a lesson so that they don't do that in the future and hurt themselves. That technically could be construed as child abuse in a lot of places. Now, however, if you were being disobedient to the system, the police could use corporal punishment on you. In fact, corporal punishment is the primary way that we deal with criminals. If a criminal is bad, if you resist arrest, then you're going to get a beat down, literally. And you'll get the book thrown at you. You could even be given the death sentence, which is the most intense form of corporal punishment. So basically, as a society, we've said that we don't want the parents doing these things that the education system, psychiatry with all their big pharmaceutical drugs, the increasingly militarized police forces, the very authoritative medical system. You know, the one thing that really irked me when I did have my children, when you have a baby in a hospital nowadays, they really do treat you like a number. They don't treat you as if the child you just had was your own. And I understand that they, for many good reasons, they try to do what's best for the child. I understand that. But in a lot of cases, they really try to make you feel as though it's a privilege that you are taking your child home. And they even do all these follow-up things, and they try to really ingrain within you the notion that you are not really in control here, that in fact we are in control. We dictate when you take your baby home from the maternity ward. And if you do take him home before we say you can take him home, then we're going to get the law involved, and we're going to make sure social services comes and scoops up your children. What this has worked itself out to is that parents have been conditioned to fear their children. People feel embarrassed nowadays when their children are screaming in the shopping cart or something like that, and they can't discipline them in any way, or else, you're given dirty looks if you dare try to discipline your child in that environment, but you're given dirty looks if your child's acting up. So parents are left in a tough spot with all of this. And just like in the Orwellian novel 1984, parents have literally been conditioned to fear their children, who could at any time rat their parents out for something, or make up some allegation about their parents. And they could be, maybe you didn't allow little Johnny to play his video games all night, so he took that to heart, and he went to school and he told the counselors that you hit him, or you assaulted him, or something like that, or you sexually abused him, or whatever the case might be. I'm not saying that that there's a lot of legitimate cases of abuse and sexual abuse and stuff like that, but what I'm trying to say is that we've offloaded the power. We've taken the parent out of the equation, and we're constantly disarming parents and putting the power in the hands of these spoiled children, which wouldn't know a day of hardship if it jumped up and bit them straight in the ass. So I'm going to go over a variety of reasons real quick. I know I've rambled on quite a bit, but the number one reason I think is that children haven't had to struggle like previous generations. Every generation from this point forward is going to be more hardwired to the grid and more dependent on technology in order to survive. That is, of course, if we're able to last that long. But the fact is that people who are being born today are going to be born into a world where they are enwrapped in this technological world, where without it, they would not be able to survive. And such is the case when we have 7 billion people and counting. The more and more people we have, the more and more technology we need, and the more regulation we need in order to keep this system well lubricated and working properly so that it can sustain all 7 billion of us. The struggles of children nowadays are superficial and they're cosmetic. Some people might argue that, well, the modern generation doesn't have to struggle with things like, is the crop going to grow this year? Or I have to walk to school 10 miles. they still have to deal with a variety of other stressful things. And quite frankly, I think that that's utter bullshit. All of this superficial and cosmetic shit that kids have to worry about these days are not real problems, no matter how you want to decorate it. If you have no experience of deprivation, scarcity, and true struggle, when you are faced with those conditions, you're probably going to fall on your face. You're probably not going to make it. There's a certain strength and resilience that can only be created by going through some sort of hardship. Nowadays a kid will complain about having to walk a couple walks to school and their parents not giving them a ride, or having to clean their room in order to, get their allowance. I don't even know if allowance is a thing. Parents just give their kids money nowadays. This never was a thing when I was a kid. When I was a kid, you at least, maybe you did get an allowance, but you had to do something for it. You had to work for it. Now it seems like the expectations of parents, there's this whole taboo against saying no to your children, a literal taboo against saying no. This is the whole positive affirmation thing in psychology nowadays, is that you always have to be positive with what you say. And what does that set kids up for? It sets them up for this candy cane fantasyland world where everything will come to them if they just be nice. It doesn't prepare them for the true harsh realities of human nature in the cutthroat world. The fact that not everybody is nice out there, and that sometimes you're going to hear no. In many cases, no hits people in the face. When I left university, no hit me in the face in a big way, because I was told over and over again that, if I did this and if I did that, I would get a good job and life would just be, handed to me on a silver platter. And of course, that does not happen. So the second thing, and these are in no particular order of significance, is that we are a human service-based economy in the Western world for the most part. We don't manufacture stuff anymore. Many of us are far removed from the land and from the extraction of raw materials from the environment, which used to be something that everybody did in order to survive. So we've progressively become more distanced from that process of cooking our own food, of digging our own outhouses. Just that the rudimentary aspects that created civilization, we are now far removed from those things. And Millennials and Generation Z are, of course, the most far removed. It's such that there's an inverse relationship between the creation of smart technology and the ability of people to be self-reliant. So the more smart technology you have, take for instance GPS is the classic example, people's ability to navigate without GPS is going to diminish. People don't know how to read a map anymore, or they just perhaps are too lazy to. Probably a combination of those things, but I think you get the point. Number 3 is that we live in a disposable society, and that kids nowadays just simply have too many things. And as a parent, I'm guilty of this because I want to give my kids lots of good stuff, the stuff that I never had. But at the same time, it comes at the cost of depriving them the experience of gratitude and appreciation for the finer things in life. It deprives them of the necessity to use their imagination in order to entertain themselves, which is going to help them think more critically, think more analytically, and which will translate well into some post-disaster situation. Should this society we enjoy ever collapse, whether it's prolonged or sudden or whatever, those are things that would help those children adapt. And I see this in my own kids, is that the more toys I get them, the less and less they appreciate them, and the less time they spend on each particular thing. And it gets to the point where they just don't have any appreciation for anything, and they are essentially, as the saying goes, spoiled. The fourth reason, and it kind of ties into the first one, it's that young people nowadays are just plain soft. Because they don't know hardship, many of them are forever in this juvenile, this stunted, infantile state of mind where you never really have to grow up nowadays. I've done whole videos on this concept before where, you have the whole Pokemon Go thing last year where you had full-grown adults walking around chasing these fake Pokemon. It's a very childish thing, but all the adults were doing it. You have all the adults watching superhero movies, and all of these things which really decades ago would have been for children. Now full-grown men are preoccupied with these things. So this is perhaps not something that's only unique to this modern generation, but it seems to be retroactive as well. Single parenting, the high divorce rates, all the rest, and that's what all this is attributed to, like mothers being the predominant caregivers in families, the father being stripped in many cases of their ability to parent, and having the mothers say override the fathers. And in many cases, at least in my experience, I'm usually the one that has to put the foot down on things in the household and say, no, it's time to stop. My wife is far more nurturing. For me, nurture it involves as much tough love as it does love. It involves saying no as much as it involves saying yes, because in saying no, you prepare your child for the harsh realities of the world that awaits them. The next thing is somewhat of a paradox, and it's that while they're soft, they're also desensitized to violence. So we created an interesting dynamic there where you have these kids who've never been exposed to hardship, but they've seen all manner of bloodshed you could possibly imagine vicariously through these video games that they play. So I have a feeling that that's going to work itself out to such an effect that where you had the Kitty Genovese scene in New York in the 70s where the woman was basically murdered while many onlookers watched as it happened and did nothing. That whole bystander effect will probably be magnified with this generation, because not only are they desensitized to violence, but they're pacified, they're pussified, they're cowards for the most part, because the anti-bullying tattletale culture has created a society of people who cannot take matters into their own hands. The anti-bullying culture, as much as I hate bullies, I hate tyrants, I must say that it's still important that children learn to stand up for themselves and manage those problems, because the fact is, in the real world, no matter how much of a pretty picture we want to pretend and paint for our children, the reality is that the real world isn't like that. So when they do cross that line, when they become a fully fledged tax-paying citizen and they turn 18 years old and they realize that the world isn't all sunshine and rainbows, and the real bullies in our society aren't brought to justice. They have a lot of false expectations of the world, and more often than not, it's going to take them years to come to terms and integrate that into their understanding of how the world works. The next part of this, of course, is emasculation and hypersexualization. So these two things kind of go together. You have the emasculation of men and the hypersexualization of women, and really the hypersexualization of both genders or sexes, if you will. Masculinity, of course, serves a variety of survival purposes. And if we did have some social regressive throwback, those who possessed those characteristics of masculinity are likely going to be the ones that prevail. And lastly, but not least, and once again, this is not an exhaustive list, I'm sure there's a variety of things that many people are going to kick in the comments, but it's this ageism mentality, this cult of youth that we have in our society, where people no longer need to respect the experience of their elders, because the elder has been replaced essentially with Google, and no longer do you need to rely on the teachings and the stories of your elders to understand how the world works and to get insights on human relations. Now every child is a know-it-all. Being old and wise is not a trait which is revered, and it's not a trait which is sought after, and it's not a trait that gets a lot of credit. Whether that's by chance or by design, it's unknown. Regardless, there is a disrespect for a lack of appreciation for the experience of the elders and the family unit as a whole. That's another thing, is that the millennials are being brought up with this understanding that family doesn't really matter that much. What matters most is themselves and sensation seeking and hedonism and all of the rest, and just basically being your own god. And of course, conceding your body and your mind to the whole transhumanist blah blah blah. Anyways, this video has went on long enough. Let me know what you think in the comments section. I like doing these more thought-provoking videos every so often just to get people thinking. Stay tuned tomorrow because we're going to get back on track with the preparedness thing. We're going to be doing a Mountain House giveaway. Tomorrow is going to be Mountain House Monday, and we're going to be doing the first of 6 giveaways throughout the course of summer, where I do some taste tests and I give away some Mountain House. So stick around for that. It's going to be very easy to participate. Alright guys, thanks for watching Canadian Prepper out.